Welcome to part 3 of the Plea Bargain Project introductory videos. Today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different than the other two files. We're not going to focus on how Animate does things, but instead review how to structure the beginning of your project. This is session 3. It's going over how to create a scene, but it could also be considered appropriate to view before any part. So one of the most important things on the project in general is that you're creating a product, something that the people you are making this product for need. Because of that, you need to create a certain set of content that lives up to a certain standard and fits a certain criteria. Because of that, we always have to go through how a project starts and how a project ends when it is made for a client and it is made needing to fill a certain criteria. So when you're creating any scenario for the Plea Bargain Project, the first and most important thing is to review the script. Reviewing the script is something that will help you brainstorm. So let's say for this scenario of the Plea Bargain Project, you're told that you need to figure out a way for the character to so let's say they need to rob a bank. Obviously that's a little extreme. It wouldn't be something that we would actually do because it's a little too serious for the nature of the Plea Bargain Project. But you have a script that says, I'm gonna rob a bank. You've already gone over styles. You know how to draw the avatar at this point. Now, there will never be a point in the project where you won't review style, but this is probably the only part where you don't actively need to watch and gauge everything you do based on the style of the avatars. So you're going along and you're like, how do I start? Well, the easiest thing you do is you really start from the basics. You create a storyboard. For those who don't know, storyboarding is a summary and an almost comic style of the events that happen and that you're going to be drawing. So, for instance, if I'm going to have a character rob a bank, I'm going to want a whole bunch of scenes where it leads up to and ends with how they rob the bank. Let's say that the first situation is I have the avatar walk into a bank. Because there's always an innocent or guilty scene, there's got to be a generic scene where they walk into the bank. So we have this character who's just walking on into the bank. They've got a smile, they're innocuous. Now, one of the most important things to remember when you're doing things like storyboarding is to think about the scenes that you're setting up. So if I have a character who's walking into a bank, it's actually probably not a good idea to have them facing forward. It is actually strategically harder to animate something that's coming at you and moving away from you. The reason why is because it's more difficult to create a walk cycle. Walk cycles are basically the animator's most important tool, and we can utilize them repeatedly in a project. So, as you might have noticed from one of our scenarios, one scenario has a character walking from an angle towards a car, and the second has them walking in a walk cycle. With a walk cycle, you can just repeat the frames over and over again, meaning that when I created this asset here where the first thing we see is a character kind of face forward, in a storyboard where they must be walking into a bank, I'm actually creating a pretty hard thing for myself to animate later. Whereas if I say in this scene, hey, this character's walking forward, they're from the side, it's going to be able to be a simple frame. So the second scenario in the Plea Bargain Project has a character walking into a mall from the side. This is actually very simple and very easy. It also has a character walking into a store. What actually might have been easier than what we ended up doing, and easier than the first scenario, which I created, is you have a walk cycle scenario, and when they reach the door, instead of changing the perspective, we just have them change the door. We just have them stop in frame and open the door. And that would have been a much easier thing to do. One of the reasons why you storyboard is because you want to brainstorm how you're setting up each individual scene. So I learned right away that I don't want a character to be walking towards the bank and into the bank from a front view. I want to have a character who's walking from the side so that I can create a walk cycle that's usable in every scenario. And I also learned that perhaps I want to make it so that when they're opening a door and walking into the building, I can still utilize that walk cycle in as many ways as possible. So, always create a storyboard. This is, of course, not a standard storyboard that I set up here. It's just an example. You'll find lots of templates on Google. But going through with yourself and creating these storyboards is super important for understanding how you, as the animator, are going to set up a scene. And if you work in a team, this is vital. You cannot skip over the storyboard process. The process is vital. So, I decide for myself, all right, so I'm going to have them go into the store, and then here's where everything changes, because actually they were wearing a really confusing hat. And that made all the security footage look a little weird. And maybe it blocked the sight. And a security camera, like, caught me, making a weird hand gesture. And it looks like I robbed the bank. Obviously, the script for this is not sound. I made it up on the fly. But I'm fitting what I'm being given. And as long as you're fitting what you're being given, then you're doing your job. Now, illustrating in a storyboard actually shows you and shows the person you're working with, your supervisors, how their script works. Many times in this process, I had to change things, and the script got touched up based on what I was doing. I think this storyboard would highlight that that's actually not a good scenario for showing off somebody who could typically be considered innocent or guilty, because they could have witnesses, or they could have security footage that just outright shows that you're actually innocent or you're actually guilty, which we don't want that. We want ambiguous things. But for the sake of insinuation, what if I sent it back to my supervisor and they said, that's great, that's exactly what I want, and it fits the scenario I need. For future versions of the project, maybe they do want something that fits like that. And you are creating this outline so that you can get your supervisor's approval to say, yep, this is what I want you to animate, and this is everything that you're going to do. So, you have created this storyboard, and for some reason, you've created it, you've revised it with other animators, you've revised it with your supervisor. Okay, so what do you do next? Well, you move on to the animation phase, which is a little bit different. So, when you move on to your animation phase, you are obviously creating now a new asset that's based on what you did before. But an important step is to remember that you don't just go straight into your final animations. You make rough animations that are going to be relevant to what you created. Because if you don't create those, you're not going to know. Just like you would have a storyboard to create a rough idea of how the project is going to look, you're going to create a rough animation to give a rough idea of how animated that idea looks. You obviously can't show anybody how things are going to look until you show them, as simple as that sounds. So your employer won't know what they've seen in a storyboard looks like until you animate it. But say that that's not actually what they want. You don't want that to be wasted. Or say that you make a tiny mistake and it's something that actually definitely crucially needs to be changed. That's why you do a rough storyboard, and then you do a rough outline. And your rough outline of the animation is going to be like the simple skeleton of the figure that is changed. Now, I don't know how well acquainted you are with Animate, so I'm going to assume you don't know any of it. We're going to turn onion layering on so that I can see the layer I just created. And I'm going to create a miniature, not great walk cycle that's just for you, my protege, to understand. Now, say that you are trying to make a compelling walk cycle in this scenario to show an idea off. And say the motions are funky. Well, you can't explain your perspective on this walk cycle until you've actually drawn it. Obviously, I'm not going to go into depth here and draw a whole walk cycle, but I can draw an outline of something so that you can understand what I'm trying to say. So, pretend that this is. I'm going to put this on repeat so that you can see how terribly it moves. Yes, so say that this is all you've done, and you bring it in. Obviously, this is going to be a great way to give feedback. Your employer will be able to say, well, that's just very jittery. And you can definitely pause there and say, how do I fix this? If you just jump straight into line arting a product that isn't actually up to the standards it needs to meet, then that just means you're going to have to start over or start back, and you will lose hours and hours of work, and nobody wants you to do that. So always do a rough version of your animation so that when you move forward, you've created the best version of the product. Don't just jump straight into the black and white version. Always have a rough. And that's pretty much what this session is about, creating roughs. So after you've created the beautiful product, and you've had your animations looked over, something you can do before you go and get supervisor approval is make sure that your styles match. Now, this is something you should be doing the entire time, but obviously in storyboarding, I said you don't need to do that, and that's true. But once you've moved past the roughs and you've got all the motions of the body, now it becomes the time you need to revise things. This is when you should probably make a secondary save file for your animation and change it from rough version, insert title, insert scene, insert project. The semantics will obviously be given to you, and then change it to final line art version, or line art version, scene 2, scenario 2, or scenario 3 in this case. And then you can make many changes, like adding line art and then deleting the rough layer, and now you have a secondary file. So for instance, say that I created a secondary file and the file was alright, the file was final 2, and then I wanted to go in and I wanted to line art it in black because all the lines in the project final versions are black. And then I go through and I line art it, and I decide, all right, obviously when you really line art, you won't be making it this way. But then you delete it, and there you go. But because you created a secondary version, you'll still have that original rough line art, so that if anything goes wrong or you accidentally permanently save over and delete it before you're ready, you save it. That's why we always create different versions of products. Now, after you have created the line arts and style match on your own, you review this with your supervisors one final time. From then on, you can move forward to the next part, which is creating a scene part 2, and you've created your line art, and I will meet you there in reviewing that step of the project.